I'm going to move on now to giving you a quick presentation of Canada. And as you see on the title, I've put something which is very important to understand, is that Canada is a very segmented market. So why is that? A few reasons. First of all, politically, as I mentioned, we have 3 levels of government, and those 3 levels of governments all play a very strong role in the development of the country and its daily activity. So again, the federal government and the capital and most of the federal agency and politicians are in Ottawa, in Ontario. And then the provincial level, so again, 10 provinces, and I did put them by the order of size. So Ontario, 14.2 million of inhabitants, Quebec, 8.4, British Columbia, 4.8, Alberta, 4.3, Manitoba, Saskatchewan. And the maritime provinces. Maritime provinces are the eastern part of Canada. Before I show you on the map where Halifax is, so it's all that area around Halifax. So where you have Newfoundland and Labrador, which is the northern part of the maritime provinces. Prince Edward Island, that we here call in Canada PEI, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. British Columbia and Alberta are often referred as the Western provinces or the Rocky provinces. Manitoba and Saskatchewan are often referred as the plains. So in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, it's probably the flattest part of the world that you've ever seen. It's super flat. That's where they grow a lot of crops, and that's where you have also a lot of natural resources. And then the 3 territories, as I mentioned, Yukon, Northwest Territory, and Nunavut. Those territories are the northern part of Canada, and there is very little there in terms of urbanization, mainly indigenous communities, and again, a lot of natural resources. The main cities I've covered quickly, but just to give you some figures on the population. So Toronto, which now really became the heart of the business the heart of the economy in Canada. So with 6.3 million. When I say Toronto, 6.3 million, I actually mean the GTA, which means the Greater Toronto Area. So typically here in Canada, when we talk about a city and its population, it's really the city and the close suburb. So you have Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, and Ottawa, which are the main cities. So the population of Canada, and even so, we have the second largest country in the world. The population is only 38.1 million people. So with in terms of density, it's per square kilometer, it's very low. But those numbers are kind of the tree hiding the forest, because the truth is that the Canadian population is very, very urbanized. 82% of the population lives in one of those big cities I've mentioned. So everybody is concentrated in what we call the South Belt, which is a bandwidth of about 300 kilometers just north of the US border. And there is a very good reason for that, is that anything north of it becomes very difficult in the winter in terms of climate. But we'll come back on the climate subject a little bit later. In terms of ethnicity, Canada has been built by a lot of immigration, and it's still the case today. We see some major influx of immigration with COVID, we had obviously a little bit of a slowdown, but immigration is the reason of the growth of the population in Canada. So in terms of ethnicity, we have people defined as Canadian, English, Scottish, French, Irish, and German are historically the biggest community. But now we have a very many Chinese, and sorry, the Italian are now behind the Chinese in terms of percentage, but Italian has been a big part of the development of Canada as well. But so Chinese, Eastern Indian, and Ukrainian, and when you see the percentage of the Ukrainian, you'll understand that the war in Ukraine right now has been for the Canadian population pretty touching, because we all know, somehow at least an Ukrainian family that live close to us. Languages, there's 2 official languages in Canada, and that's, please take a big note of that. Languages is very important in Canada, and it's discussed daily politically. So in terms of population, English speaking represents 77% of the population, French 23%, and we have about 18% of the population who's fully bilingual. Most of the bilingual population is located in the Montreal, Ottawa area. So in Ottawa is really at the border between Ontario and Quebec. And so on one side of the river, it's Ottawa. On the other side, it's Gatineau. So Ottawa in Ontario, Gatineau in Quebec, but people commute every day from Gatineau to Ottawa and vice versa for work. So in this area of Canada, almost everybody is fully bilingual, and it's the same in Montreal. You have a good share of bilingual people. In the rest of Canada, it's a little bit more challenging to find French-speaking people. There are some communities like Saint-Boniface, for example, in Winnipeg, in the northern part of Ontario. But please keep in mind that even so the numbers show 77% and 23%, it's very located, meaning that a big part of those 20% of French-speaking are in Quebec, and all the other ones are outside of Quebec. So why it's so important, the languages? Well, first of all, because when you work with the federal government, you have the obligation to have everything bilingual. So let's say you work with them and you sell to Transport Canada a piece of equipment. You will have to make sure that all the documentation you're providing is bilingual, French and English. You will have to make sure that if you provide any training, it has to be in French and English. So that's that's a big part of what it is. What's the date today? June 8th. So about 2 weeks ago in Quebec, they passed a new law. They call it Bill 96 to reinforce the usage of French in Quebec and to make it mandatory, for example, in healthcare, to have all the services in French. So again, it seems like a detail probably when you're from far away, but it's really part of the daily life and part of some challenges that are faced by some businesses locally also, but even more importantly by business coming from outside to address the language issue properly. And then, thanks to immigration, we have a few other languages that are widely spoken: Punjabi, Cantonese, and Mandarin. So many spoken at home, but those are right now the 3 main languages. And actually, there was a survey not long ago, and one of the analysts was saying that French is not the second language in Canada anymore. It's probably Cantonese right now, in terms of how many people speak the language at home. So again, sorry if I'm insisting a lot, but please make a good note, and when you talk to your members at the Integrate, that language is a big part of what Canada is. Do you have any question on that? Because it's not very common. I guess you have the situation in northern Italy and in Switzerland, but it's not very common to have many languages to deal with. No? Okay, so I'll move on to the next.
Yes, Marco has a question.
Sorry, I have one question concerning the languages. When you say that the documents submitted need to be bilingual, do the translations need to be done by official personnel, or is it just normal translation acceptable?
Yeah, so it will depend on what type of documents we're talking about. If it's an official document, let's say that's been reviewed by a notary and that has some administrative value, it has to be reviewed by some official translator. If it's for business and business only, it doesn't have to be stamped by any officials. This be and actually it does lead to many pretty interesting situation where people just use Google Translate to go from their English document to their French and vice versa. And you see, you know, in your daily life on food packaging, for example, where obviously the food has been, for example, produced in the US and repackaged for Canada, and they use Google Translate or some other device of that type. And the translation is totally off. Like, for example, there was one, it was made, what was it? It was something like made in Turkey. And the translation was in French, fabriqué par une dinde. So made by a chicken. So it can lead some pretty interesting situation, but as a business, if you have some, especially if it's safety related product, you want to make sure that the translation is perfect. You can't afford to have some approximative translation, but I don't think you really need any for that type of document. You don't have to be stamped by any officials. Sorry, I'm just going to catch the phone. Excuse me. Sorry about that.
Okay, thanks.
Does it answer your question, Marco?
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, I realized I didn't turn off my phones. Okay, it's done now. So the climate is also a very important and big part of the definition of what Canada is. I think everybody knows or has some type of understanding that Canada is a rough country when it comes to climate. But we actually have some very different climates between east and west and north and south. So typically what you have to remember is that the eastern part and the western part of Canada, which are just next to the two oceans, Atlantic on the east and Pacific on the west, are typically more temperate and don't have winters that are as cold and summers that are as hot. But the interiors, so Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, also to a certain extent, have some very, very cold winter and some very, very hot and humid summer. And so why is that important? It's when it comes to business and especially to the railway industry, it's because when you're going to look at the specs in a RFQ, especially if there is some electronics in the device that you're offering, you will see that the requests are quite a wide range, and typically they will ask for the product to be able to be used for temperature between -40 Celsius to +40 Celsius. And that's not just because they want to make it difficult for you, it's because that's what the equipment's going to be really exposed to. For example, one of my clients, they do some equipment to measure the water level in lakes and rivers. And so those equipment are left during the winter, and that can be in northern part of Quebec. And the temperature will reach easily -40, -45. So if you want to measure the level of the lake, and that can be quite sensitive in terms of inundations, you better make sure that your equipment is able to resist those temperatures. So it's a big part of what your members have to understand, is that it's not because your equipment is working very well downtown Rome or Berlin that it's going to work well everywhere in Canada. And so the requirement for equipment that goes outside is very high. I'm just going to give you a very simple example, but you know, we all have one of those cell phones, and it's crazy how in the winter time, if you leave your phone in the outside pocket of your jacket, how when your phone battery will last for maybe typically 24 hours. On a cold day when it's -30 and you spend 2 or 3 hours outside, the battery is totally drained after 3 hours. So, you know, your piece of equipment that was working normally for 24 hours now only work for 3 hours in terms of battery. So please keep that in mind, because it's part of all the requests in RFQs that the equipments are able to hold in those very cold and very hot and humid temperature. The other thing about climate is that, you know, especially in winter time, you cannot start a discussion in Canada without, not a conversation, but a meeting without having, you know, 1 minute that's being discussed about what's happening with the weather. It's really embedded in people's life, and they talk about climate all the time because it's so big. Any question on that? So I'll move on. So as I mentioned already, the government has different level of government: federal, provincial, municipal. As far as the federal government, you have to understand that Canada is a very young country. It was only in 1982 that the British Parliament passed the Canadian Act, which formally made Canada independent and have the ability to change its own constitution. So 1982, some of us were born, I was born at that time. So you understand it's very recent. Canada is a constitutional monarchy, so we have a prime minister, but the highest level is the Queen of England. Even so, she has no political impact, but she has a permanent representative in Canada called the Gouverneur Général. General governor, and that person has more of sorry, I can't find the word in English, but they must have a role of institutional role than anything else. Again, the Constitution stipulates that either English or French has to be used in all institutions, and it's either or, but actually it's it's French and English in most instances. It's being required. And so I'd just like to come back on one point that's very important, is that how the different competencies are divided between federal and provincial. So for example, healthcare, education, those are provincial competencies. Transportation, criminal law, that's federal. So try to make it easy, but everything that's related to development of people is provincial. Everything that have subjects that are more global to the country, like defense, transport, that's federal. But it's not very clear cut, but that's kind of what it is. But in any way, you always have to double check. And some, like agriculture, for example, it's divided between both. So you have some agriculture plan and funding by the federal government, but then it's applied at the provincial level, where each province can have their own agriculture policy put in place. You know, I was mentioning that Canada is a fairly young country, and I think what's very interesting is those dates. Montreal was founded in only 380 years ago, Toronto only 229 years ago, and Vancouver only 136 years ago. So keep in mind that, again, it's very, very young compared to what we know in Europe. So economy and resources, that's important because especially the economy and resources have really defined what is a railway sector today. So the Canadian economy is dominated by the private sector. It used to be way more Crown corporation, but the choice was made to sell a lot of the activity to the private sector. So except for postal services and some electric utilities and some transportation services, such as Via Rail, for example, most of the economy is driven by the private sector. Agriculture, I was talking about it briefly, but please understand that agriculture is organized in a way that's very geared toward where is the population. So around large cities such as Montreal and Toronto, that's where you have most of the dairy farms, so where you have most of the chicken farms. So everything that's animal protein is basically close by from the main cities. And then further to the big cities, and especially what we call the plains, so again, Manitoba and Saskatchewan, it's mainly crops. And that crops, it's either used to feed the animals, to make animal proteins, or to feed the humans, but it's very divided. And so, as you can imagine, the crops and all the cereals being grown where there is very little people, then a lot of the crops is traveling by train from those areas to more urban cities and to plant where it's being transformed and processed. Forestry, half of Canada is covered by forest. World leader in exportation of pulp and paper. And here again, you can imagine the forest are not downtown Toronto or Montreal. So again, a lot of wood is being transported from those remote areas to the urban center by the means of train. In terms of minerals, Canada is very rich in mineral resources. Again, mining has been a key factor in developing some remote communities. And again, the best way to get those minerals from the remote communities to the processed plant has been by railways. In terms of energy, and I think that's pretty interesting because Canada is very strong in hydroelectric power. In Quebec, for example, you have a company named Hydro-Québec. They have power dam on all the main rivers, and they produce a lot of hydroelectricity. Some of it that they sell to the US and to Ontario. So you will expect that, you know, with all that electricity being available, that maybe a lot of the railway will be on electric system. But actually, and I'm sorry, I don't have the number here. Maybe it's further in the presentation, but the share of electric railway it's less than 2%, I believe. It's very, very, very little. And manufacturing, Canada is very strong in manufacturing for everything that's steel products. Canada do not have a car manufacturer company, but we have a lot of car manufacturing plant, especially US and Japanese companies are located in Canada because energy is cheaper, because labor is better trained. So, and then again, those goods have to be moved across North America, and train is the transportation of choice. So, you know, the infrastructure of the economy has really led to the development of the railway industry in Canada. Any question, comment on that? No? So just to give you a quick overview of who Canada is working with in terms of export and import, sorry. So definitively you can see US is the biggest partner. China is taking a fair share into that. And then you have Japan and UK and Mexico, thanks to the NAFTA agreement. When it comes to import, we have some imports, a little bit of import from Europe. Germany is leading the pack, followed by UK, and the others are coming kind of far behind. So that led me to talk to you about the different free agreements that Canada has signed. And they've signed many free agreements with a lot of countries in the world, but I'm going to focus here on the 3 free agreements that are directly of interest to European companies. So the first one, which was signed in September 2017, it's known as the CETA, so the Canada-European Union Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. So basically, the CETA, as of today, allows about 98% of the goods to travel between Canada and Europe and vice versa, with no tax on with free duties. But I just want to make a point here is that because they removed the barriers on duties, there are still some barriers that exist. And for you members that are mainly in equipment, and I guess a lot of them have some engineering product, please keep in mind that, you know, there's a lot of non-official barriers. But for example, a European engineer that will come to Canada, make some drawings, will not be allowed to sign those drawings. They will need to have a counterpart in Canada, which has an engineering degree in Canada, to be able to sign those documents, to be valid in the Canadian market. So It's the same for the law, for example. If you have a lawyer that comes from Europe and start to work as a lawyer in Canada, they can do so, and they cannot sign anything as a lawyer until they get their equivalency. And beyond that, you have some quotas that are also in place. One of the easy one is a quota on dairy, for example. So it doesn't really concern your members, but just to illustrate that, you know, it's a free trade agreement, but we can only bring a certain amount of dairy product, including cheese, to Canada, and that's why we have a poor choice of cheese in Canada, unfortunately. When the UK, after the Brexit, so the UK was originally part of the CETA, and so after the Brexit, they signed another free trade agreement, which called the TCA, which is basically just an extension or continuity of the CETA. So it's the same term, and they've applied it to the UK only, and they've signed that agreement. And finally, because I think it's important to understand the dynamic in North America. So we had for many years a NAFTA, and then President Trump came and said that agreement is not good for the US, so he shut it down. And so the new NAFTA is called the CUSMA, and it's pretty much a free trade agreement between Canada, United States, and Mexico. That is very important when you have one of your members who's developing some product and consider producing those products locally because they want to address the whole North American market. It doesn't really matter where they're located between those three countries. Their product will then travel free of duties between the three countries. So please keep that in mind, because often Canada is seen as a great place for European companies to settle, and from Canada to address the North American market. And why I say Canada is a great place, because there's a few reasons, but one of them being that, you know, it's easy to do business. For a company from France, Quebec is easy with the French language. For the other country, you can go to any other places, and English is a language of reference. For immigration, so if you want to send some people from your team, it's much easier to do that in Canada than it is in the US. So energy is at a lower cost. Typically, the labor is well trained. So Canada is a pretty interesting place if you want to start some operation to address the whole North American market. So yeah, I've covered most of that, but I've put a little bit more details on what are CETA and TCA. Maybe some point I should put some emphasis on. It's the rule of origin. So it make it very clear now how it's defined where its product is from and where it has been manufactured. Beyond the fact that it's duty-free, it's also a much easier system, so it does accelerate all the transaction between Europe and Canada, and the duty and custom are pretty, I would say, are fairly easy administrative procedures. One of the big points is when it comes to a regulatory and certification. So even so there is a free trade agreement, there is no automatic equivalence between a certification, so EU mark, for example, and a standard in Canada. It does facilitate, it does accelerate. So if you have the EU mark, you don't have to redo everything, but you typically still need to have the Canadian equivalent for your product to be fully compliant with the Canadian legislation. Government procurement, that's definitely a big one. Thanks to the CETA, any European companies can answer any RFP from the different level of government in Canada. So it can be from the federal, provincial, or municipal level. And you don't need to have a Canadian partner. I still think it's a good idea to have a Canadian partner and to answer with them. But on some project, and when it makes sense, you can answer as a European company to public tenders that take place in Canada. Investment, I quickly talk about Canada being a good place. There is some regulations that protect your investment. So the climate of investment between Europe and Canada is very good and with a lot of visibility and accessibility. And then if we talk about labor, it's easier, but it's not always super easy. Meaning that if your members have a project to develop in Canada, open a subsidiary, and send some people to work there, it has to be part of the project from early stage, because immigration in Canada is always potentially a little bit of a challenge. But if you have, for example, you sell a piece of equipment, it needs to be installed. Thanks to CETA, that has been clarified, and so you can send people temporarily, but they still will need to have a work visa to do so. Any question on that?
I have one question, Jan.
Yes. Who's speaking, sorry?
Sorry, it's Veronica.
Yeah,
We have problems with my voice, so sorry once again. My question was, yes, of course, I was aware about CETA, yes, and about CUSMA. So my question is, let me say, trying to make the most of these two free trade agreements. Is there a way, I mean, for an SME from Europe to create, what is the best way, okay, for an SME from Europe to exploit the synergies, okay, between CETA and CUSMA? You already, okay, addressed and emphasized the importance of Canada as a platform, okay, to address the North American markets from Europe. But my question is a bit more technical, and it is about is there a specific process, or do you see any specific process that can help us identify in CETA what, let me say, some simplifications, some easy procedures that can then, let me say, create the conditions for the European SME to also benefit from CUSMA in the sense of addressing the US market. So, or the other way around, if CETA makes it possible for an SME from Europe to have a better access to Canadian market, and that's clear, should a European SME in any case be based in Canada, and opening a branch in Canada will be easier thanks to CETA? But is it in any case necessary, this Canadian base, then to exploit the facilitations offered by CUSMA? I hope ultimately
yes.
it was clear.
So I'll try to to understand as much as I can. So first of all, you have to understand that it depends what we're talking about. If we talk about goods and products, it's always the rules of origin. So if your product is manufactured in Italy, and then thanks to CETA, it comes to Canada on a, free of duties, that product will not be able to travel free of duty to the US because the rule of origin will say that your product is from Italy, and unless Italy and the US have a free trade agreement, that product will still be reputed coming from Italy. So when it enters the US market, the product will have to pay some taxes. Now, there are different situations where a product is actually a part of a larger product, so it's only a sub-product. So in that case, it depends on the percentage that your product represent in the whole product, right? So yeah, and so in that instance, you can have your product going to Canada, being installed in a larger piece of equipment, and then go to use the US. And they look at the big product and they consider that the percentage made in Canada is large enough that the whole product is free of tax. So that can be a possibility. So the other answer to that is now if a European company creates a subsidiary in Canada and to that matter of fact to the US as well, that's definitively reciprocal. But so let's say they create a branch in Canada, and from Canada they manufacture locally with a partner with their own production plant. All those products are reputed to be manufactured in Canada, and therefore they will travel to the US and Mexico free of duties. The other very important thing is beyond the duties themselves, there is also the question of references. So meaning that you send a product to Canada, you sell that product in Canada, and you start to have some clients in Canada, clients that like the product, that like the service, that like the after sales. Now, when you go to the US, it's much easier because you have some North American references. And so, and I will address that a bit later, but both Canadian and US companies typically don't give too much importance to your references in Europe because they understand that everything is so different. But as soon as you have a reference in Canada or a reference in the US, it's considered as a North American reference, and people will trust that your product is working well on both markets. The other thing is, legislation, regulation, standards are much closer between Canada and the US in general than what it is between Canada and Europe. So again, if you've sold a product in North America, it doesn't matter if it's in the US or Canada, it will be considered as a North American reference, and meaning that you've been able to address all the certification issues, and therefore that you're able to deliver, not only sell, but deliver the product and the services that go with it. So yeah, I don't know, did I answer your question?
Absolutely, yes, in a very, very comprehensive way. I thank you very much. You covered any possible option, so thanks a lot. Very clear.
Thank you, Veronica. Anybody else? No. So I'm just going to move on. So here are just a few stats about the exports between the export and import of goods between Europe and Canada. I think what's very interesting here to note is how in 2017 the signature of the CETA has really helped in the development of the business relation between Canada and Europe. I mean, you look at the number in 10 years, they've not doubled, but grew by almost 40%. And the CETA is definitively responsible for at least part of it. Here you have a little bit more details. You'll get that document as a reference if it's of interest to you. I don't think there is any point going through everything. So here I just find it interesting. I was mentioning before that Germany is leading the pack, so that's imports. So Germany importing from Canada, so Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, France, Spain, Italy, and then if you look at the export, Germany really dominant, followed by Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, France, Spain. So Germany is doing pretty well. The other one still have a lot of potential to do and to develop their export relation with Canada. So I've talked about the importance of standard and regulation and certification in my answer to Veronica, but this is a very important subject because, again, it's not fully integrated in the CETA, and not only Canada has some standards that are at the federal level, but if you look at some sector of activity, and for example in construction, the building code can be different from one province to the next. So an electrician, for example, in Ontario, cannot act as an electrician in Quebec. So, you know, it's pretty shocking for some of you that people within the same country don't have all their education that's recognized, but that's the way it is, and you often have to adapt. So when it comes to the railway standard, everything is defined and enforced either at the federal and provincial level, but everything is under the Canadian Railway Safety Act. So you have the link here, and that's something you can easily share with your members. That safety regulation and safety act is pretty much divided into 20 rules and standards, and they all very easy to access and pretty comprehensive in the way they're defined. This being said, I had a client 2 years ago that was doing some connectors, electric connectors with application in the mining and the railway industry, as well as ship to shore. And we are still not sure 100%. And even so, we've had the discussion with a distributor, with a manufacturer, with the standard bodies. We're still not 100% sure when it does and when it does not apply to those connectors, the specific Canadian law, because again, those products are never standalone product, are part of larger equipment. And for that reason, it's always difficult to know if the product itself has to be certified, or if that's the whole system that has to be certified. So the cost of getting your product certified can be pretty high. So it's always a good idea to check that in advance and try to make sure you understand. At one point, it has to be certified as a standalone, or it can be integrated in another system, and the whole system can be standardized, and therefore you don't, as a supplier, have to support that cost. So it's not an easy subject. It can be quite tricky, and a lot of attention has to be paid on that subject. And like always, when you talk to the people who are in charge at the government level, it's very difficult to have a very clear, straightforward answer. So you have to involve people in the private who specialize in those questions most of the time. So I'm jumping to public procurement. As I mentioned before, the public, so thanks to CETA, all European companies can answer to public procurement. So there are different levels, again, from the federal, provincial, municipal level, and all those all those standards are public and pretty easy to access. So you have different websites. One is buyandsell.gc.ca. So this one is for federal procurement, and then you have some that are for province. So the two main ones for Quebec are SEAO, for Ontario is Jaeger. And so going on those websites, you will have a lot of information. So those standards are very detailed. You can find the history of similar tenders. You can find the information on who won the previous tender, at what price it was awarded. So all the information is easy to access and free. And then you have also some other private platforms such as Merx that will give you some tools to cover both federal and provincial tender, and so you can get some notification when it comes to your sector of activity. So at the federal level, all contracts above $25,000 for goods and $40,000 for services have to go through a tender. All the suppliers have to comply with a code of conduct for procurement. So please keep in mind that there is no shortcut, there is no going around. There are procedures in place and you have to follow those procedures, and don't try to go around, don't try to be sneaky about it. It's just not going to work, and that's going to be red flagged. And it's probably not a good idea as a European SMEs not to follow all those rules. I've been answering to a few tender. I mentioned my client doing some equipment for Lake and River. So just to illustrate, so the client is the Ministry of Environment for Quebec. So they put a tender together, and so we've answered that tender. But actually what was very interesting is that to make it very fair, the tender and the specs of the tender are defined by the Ministry of Environment, but the tender itself is written and managed by another agency within the Quebec government, and it's that agency that send out the RFQ, that receives the RFQ, open the envelope, and make sure that the answer is compliant. And so my client forgot to send one administrative piece of paper, and I was really not much, like it was just an administrative formality, and because that paper was missing, we got disqualified right away, and there was no going back. They didn't want to hear anything from us for that specific tender because we had forgotten that piece of paper. Even so, our price was a bit lower and the technology was definitively at least as good. So follow the rules and make sure you're compliant with what is being asked in those tenders. Maybe one point, we'll get back on that, but I just want to, you know, Petra mentioned that people in Canada are very nice, but before being nice, they're business people. And so if they see an opportunity to, you know, either make money or get a competitive advantage on you, they will. And so it's very important that you protect your IP when you answer to those tenders, because you never know who's going to have access to the information. So make sure your IP is well protected when you answer to any tenders.